A fun program tonight because we do have 3 members of the community who are doing the narration of the slides that you'll be looking at. And we're very pleased to have Emma Northcott, who is a senior at Sobrato. And Jane Blissett, who maybe you can't see behind the podium. Jane's a senior, but not at Sobrato. She's a member both of the Friends of the Library and of AAUW. And then you're probably all familiar with Marty Cheek, our token man. Marty's a columnist for the Morgan Hill Times. And Vicki was very clear that she thought a man ought to participate tonight. And it's true. If it weren't for men, we never would have gotten the vote, because men were the only ones who could vote to give that right to women. So we're very grateful to Marty and all the men of the time who finally came through after 72 years of struggle. So as Vicki pointed out, all the books over on the table are available to be checked out if you want to, if you're interested. There's a lot of children's books, so it's really fun to introduce children to the subject too. Most people have not a clue what we're about tonight, but this is pretty exciting. It's been 90 years. This year, we celebrate the 90th anniversary of women winning the right to vote. This great crusade, led by American suffragists, empowered by women in all walks of life, and enfranchised half the country. It was the first great civil rights movement of the 20th century. Suffragists literally wrote women into American history, as this wonderful illustration from 1915 suggests. Many people find it amazing that women weren't always considered equal citizens, but it's true. For years, only men voted on the issues and candidates of the day. In 1920, according to some historians, Congress gave women the vote by passing the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, guaranteeing women's suffrage. But women weren't really given the vote by men. Women won the vote by persuading voters and by winning elections. For over 5 decades, suffragists campaigned to put the question of women voting on the ballot and then to convince enough men to vote to enfranchise women. That was no easy task, and it demanded a degree of boldness and daring that we celebrate today.
One of the movement's early leaders, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, pictured here on the right with Susan B. Anthony, remembered that night after night, by an old-fashioned fireplace, we plotted and planned the coming agitation. Stanton and Anthony were remarkable American leaders who devoted their lives and talents to women's equality. Their goal was a new constitutional amendment that enfranchised women, and they regularly testified for it before congressional committees. However, as they found out, women didn't have any political power and were unable to change the law of the land. Susan B. Anthony showed exceptional courage and a passionate love of democracy when she actually went to the polls and voted in 1872 as a test case. Anthony was not only lampooned here as the woman who dared, but she was also arrested, tried, and convicted of voting, which was a crime only because she was a woman. When the judge imposed a fine of $100, Susan B. Anthony boldly refused to pay it and told him that instead she would continue to educate all women to do precisely as I have done. Rebel against your man-made, unjust, unconstitutional forms of law that tax, fine, imprison, and hang women while they deny them the right of representation in the government.
Lucretia Mott and Lucy Stone were two of Susan B. Anthony's mentors who opposed slavery and supported women's rights. Lucretia Mott declared, "What does woman want? She wants to be acknowledged a moral, responsible being. She is seeking not to be governed by laws in the making of which she has no voice." Lucy Stone, Abby and Julia Smith, and several other suffragists chose the nation's centennial in 1876 to publicly refuse to pay their taxes to protest the fact that women had no political representation. As a result, some of their possessions, including furniture, livestock, and even a farm, were seized and sold by the government. Black women also showed great courage in the face of injustice both before and after the Civil War. There were several early black suffragists who spoke out for racial and sexual equality. Frances E.W. Harper was a successful poet and lecturer who used her earnings to aid fugitive slaves. Sojourner Truth, a former slave, spoke out for equality and preached extensively throughout the eastern states. Women in black communities worked for decades, largely separate from white suffragists, but keeping their eyes on the same prize. Over time, black women's clubs and the Baptist Church became major centers of suffragist activity throughout the country. Suffragists were discouraged when they found little support in Congress for a women's suffrage amendment to the Constitution, so they began a series of difficult but exciting electoral campaigns to win the vote in individual states. These drives needed to win the support of male voters, but the first years were discouraging.
Suffragists waged 14 state campaigns between 1867 and 1900, but they won only two, Colorado and Idaho. The two western territories that had already approved women's suffrage, Wyoming and Utah, became equal suffrage states in the 1890s. These four states, symbolized by four stars, were the only places women could vote equally with men until 1910. Several electoral campaigns were not for the faint-hearted. They were arduous and all-consuming adventures that demanded months of travel, a wide array of skills, including the power of persuasion, and an unusual degree of self-sufficiency. Suffrage organizers and field workers, like Boston's Margaret Foley here, were exceptional women who were able to meet the many challenges.
Carrie Chapman Catt, a young school teacher from Iowa who rose to national prominence, once summarized her own experience. "I have given my life to the suffrage work. I have opened the doors of churches and halls and lighted the kerosene lamps, attended to the babies while the meeting was in progress, made the speech, taken the collection, pronounced the benediction, organized the club committee, and have held all the offices imaginable, from club president up and down and sideways." Suffragists did it all out of necessity. Nearly all their work was voluntary and unpaid.
These organizers, traveling throughout rural and undeveloped areas, often found out that just getting from one place to another was an ordeal. Once, when a wreck blocked the train she was on, Carrie Chapman Catt commandeered a flat railway cart to take her back to the station. Finding a willing brakeman nearby, she took off clinging to the small cart as it set off downhill. The cart quickly gained speed, and first her lunch bag and then her hat flew off. She held on for dear life as the cart swerved violently back and forth around the steep curves for miles. It turned out the brake consisted of a piece of wood that the brakeman shoved against the wheels. When the cart finally coasted into the station, the shaken organizer climbed unsteadily off and immediately made new plans. Like most suffragists, she was determined to appear where she was expected and was resourceful enough to make it happen. Anna Howard Shaw was a beloved national leader who was also a minister, a doctor, and an acclaimed orator. She spoke for equal rights in every state and remembered being thrown to the floor of her train once when it hit a wagon full of gunpowder and dynamite. Fortunately, the dynamite was frozen, so only the gunpowder exploded. Otherwise, she would have been killed.
When Anna Howard Shaw and Susan B. Anthony were delayed by another train wreck, Shaw once famously crossed the tracks and boarded a train going in the opposite direction. "At least it's going somewhere," she called back to her astounded friend. Shaw's belief was that if one intends to get somewhere, it is better to start, even in the wrong direction, than to stand still. Suffragists crisscrossed the country for decades, despite the difficulties and personal dangers, to put their cause directly to the people. And that unwavering faith in democracy is part of what we remember and celebrate today. These brave and hard-working women were committed, they were courageous, and they triumphed despite all odds. One of the suffragists' greatest challenges was to win the powerful and diverse state of New York. Without it, a new constitutional amendment was impossible. In 1910, New York suffragists launched a series of vibrant, colorful parades that dramatically showed politicians women's growing demand for the vote. These festive demonstrations, complete with floats and marching bands, drew tens of thousands of marchers and hundreds of thousands of spectators. They were spectacular political events that also became major cultural and social affairs.
State leader Gertrude Brown recalled that there was something in the atmosphere on parade day. "We women who marched in the suffrage parade will never forget the thrill of hearing her own band strike up, the command of her leader, of swinging out into the avenue in step with the music, passing the multitudes of spectators, head up, eyes straight ahead, in perfect formation, with the conviction that she was marching for a great cause." Another New York leader, Harriet Stanton Blatch, who was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, realized that sermons and logic never convince, that human beings move because they feel, not because they think. For that reason, they began to dance about their cause at great balls instead of sitting in corners and arguing. Her 1913 Votes for Women ball attracted over 8,000 people. Suffragists thought creatively. For the 1915 New York campaign, they carved an actual torch of freedom out of wood and painted it gold to symbolize their democratic crusade. It drew almost reverent attention wherever it was displayed. In Pennsylvania, women recast the Liberty Bell and toured the state with it, saying it would ring only when women were able to vote.
Patriotic references and imagery like this Minute Woman from 1915 reinforce their case. One state suffrage leader, Vera Whitehouse, reasoned to a reporter that if women really belonged in the home, as opponents claimed, then maybe all women should just stay home one day. Her whimsical idea of a one-day strike sent shockwaves through New York and led to a long historical articles on the damage such an act would do to businesses, schools, hospitals, and so on. Without lifting a finger, only voicing an idea, Whitehouse made an undeniable point. Modern society depended on women's work, and women in the workforce needed and deserved the right to vote. Being bold and innovative was a good part of why suffragists were successful, winning more states. Even though they couldn't vote, these women mounted effective campaigns that helped defeat powerful opponents in the Massachusetts and New York legislatures. They also organized boycotts to pressure the major political parties and even founded their own political bodies, including the Women's Suffrage Party and the National Women's Party. Between 1900 and 1920, suffragists waged another 40 state campaigns. Remarkably, they won 11 of them, nearly all in the West. By 1919, women could vote equally with men in 15 states, and they could vote in the primaries or for presidential electors in another 15 states. This steady, deliberate buildup of strengths in so many states finally forced politicians in Washington, D.C. to recognize women's right to vote nationally, but opponents delayed action for as long as they could. The final battle in Washington, D.C. included an intense lobbying drive that grew to involve hundreds of women from throughout the nation. Suffragists testified before congressional committees, organized local pressure to sway timid politicians, and overcame every obstacle to steer the controversial bill through Congress.
At the same time, suffragists led by Alice Paul also began picketing Woodrow Wilson's White House with banners asking, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" This was the first time the White House had been picketed, and it drew national attention. The silent picketers were part of an unprecedented direct action campaign that held Wilson, as president and head of the ruling Democratic Party, responsible for passage of the 19th Amendment. Alice Paul and other suffrage leaders pointed out the bitter irony of the nation fighting a war to defend democracy abroad while denying women democracy at home. When the Wilson administration ordered Capitol Police to begin arresting the picketing suffragists in the spring, more women arrived to take their places. Hundreds of suffragists were arrested throughout 1917, and when they refused to pay their fines for obstructing traffic, they were sent to jail. In prison, some claimed status as political prisoners, jailed for their beliefs rather than any crime, and began hunger strikes in protest. Alice Paul and several other women were brutally force-fed by prison guards for weeks. Their extreme treatment drew national outrage and put additional pressure on politicians to act.
Suffragists struggled desperately to keep their cause alive during the war. Finally, the strength of their demand and the force of their pressure won out. In response to the picketing and hunger strikes, the intense lobbying, and particularly the real political gains in so many states, both houses of Congress passed the 19th Amendment in 1919. The 36th state, Tennessee, ratified it in August 1920, and after 72 years of effort, over 20 million women were enfranchised. This was the largest single extension of suffrage without a revolution, and it was accomplished solely through disciplined, nonviolent action. Looking back over 35 years of work, Carrie Chapman Catt was ecstatic. She declared, "I have lived to realize the great dream of my life, the enfranchisement of women. We're no longer petitioners. We're not wards of the nation, but free and equal citizens. Let us practice the dignity of a sovereign people."
Alice Paul emphasized that freedom has come not as a gift, but as a triumph, and it is therefore a spiritual as well as a political freedom which women receive. The 90th anniversary of the 19th Amendment is ultimately a celebration of suffragist success. Their great crusade won political liberty for women throughout the country and remade America into a more complete democracy. Winning the support of so many American men ensured that it was truly a mutual and lasting victory. There was still more to be done. It would be years before laws mandating equal pay for equal work and equality in education were put in place to protect women against sex discrimination on the job and in school. In many southern states, Black Americans remained disenfranchised until the Voting Rights Act of 1963.
But the achievements of American suffragists and the impact of the 19th Amendment are undeniable. Women play an important role in government today, and women's votes help determine our future. Suffragists left us a noble and inspiring heritage. Their great crusade embodied the core values we share as Americans, the desire for freedom, justice, and equality. And what suffragists and American men were able to accomplish together reminds us of our ability as a democratic country to constantly change and to grow. On this historic anniversary, we celebrate the fact that suffragists brought women, half the nation, into equal citizenship. As we remember and honor their achievement, we reaffirm the dreams, the values, and the qualities that help define us as Americans. In the cause of justice, as Susan B. Anthony always maintained, failure is impossible.
California women won the vote in 1911. We were one of those western states. So next year is the centennial of California winning the vote. And our speaker that night will be Robert Cooney, who has put together this wonderful book. Yeah, the library actually owns a copy of it if you want to. How many of you know this story? Okay. Okay, so a lot of this was new information. This is what's so important about getting the word out, is how many women take the right to vote for granted, don't bother to exercise that right. So I really hope that you will take the message and spread it and encourage women to get out and vote. Any of you have comments or questions about this, Teresa?
What the signs they had there, they said Connecticut women have school suffrage. Do you know what they meant by that?
It might have been states, it was not equal.
Yeah.
So it might have been that women in Connecticut were actually allowed to vote in school board elections, but that was it. And so some women could vote in something, some states allowed women to vote in all elections. So it wasn't until the 19th Amendment that all women throughout the country got the vote. Yes.
Do you know if Susan B. Anthony ever had to pay that $100? Was she ever forced to pay that?
No, she never did pay it.
She never was required.
No, and I think they tried to send her to jail, but that didn't present a very good picture for the judge, and so that was. I think he simply said, "All right, just don't do it again." Any other comments or questions?
Carol, we were talking earlier about a movie that's out called Iron-Jawed Angels.
Yes.
That's an excellent portrayal of several Alice Paul and so on, and some of the conflicts that occurred even within the women's suffrage groups.
That's true.
The black versus the white, and then there were some that were more politically activist, whereas there were some others who were just, wanted to kind of be quiet about it and just keep plugging away until things happen.
Iron-Jawed Angels, for those who aren't familiar with it, is an HBO movie that's, I think the library has a copy. It's about the militant suffragists. Oh, she's got a copy right here. That were the women who picketed the White House, who were jailed, force-fed. They had conflicts within the suffrage movement because they were militant. Katie Chapman Catt was more of a more conservative. She still worked very, very hard. She just had a different approach to it. And then again, there were white women, who were not so sure that they were trying to win southern states. And so some of them were not going to include black women in this because they were trying to win southern states. So it was really a very, lots of different groups came together to make all this happen. Yes, Karen?
Were there other countries where women could vote before we were able to
Uh-huh.
vote?
How about New Zealand in the
I have a
1890s?
Swiss friend who's just outraged that Swiss women didn't get to vote until the 60s.
Yeah, New Zealand was 1890 something. So
Is it Iceland?
Iceland, New Zealand. Yeah, no, there were many countries that, even countries that you wouldn't really think of giving equal rights to women. gave women the right to vote before the United States did.
Yes, there were some photographs of men that actually marched with the women, and how much, I guess, was that prevalent, and that was certain parts of the country where there were more men that
Well, we can make guesses of which were the more liberal parts of the country. But first of all, we know the West was, because that's where women got the vote first. There were 2 territories where women had the vote before they became states, and then they just continued when they became states. Southern states voted against ratification. That's why it came down to Tennessee, because these other southern states had voted against ratifying this. But women, there are many men, and there had to be, otherwise it would never have happened. There were many men who supported suffrage for women and actively supported it. Even those who maybe didn't do the marching, if their wives were off in Washington, D.C., or if their wives were planning protests or marches, someone had to be home minding the home fires. So men helped in many different ways, besides being the ones that actually cast the votes.
Carol, can you talk about maybe the organized opposition to women's suffrage, like the Catholic Church, I believe, was one, and there's also a women's group that was anti.
Yes, not all women thought that they should have the vote, that it would be demeaning to them. And many women didn't exercise the vote when they did get it, or they voted the way their husbands told them to. And I think we still see some of that today, but yes, it was definitely organized opposition. And you've been doing a little reading about that too, so I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Just, it was, well, like the Christian faith, I mean, there seemed to be a divide. Some groups, some churches said, hey, you know, this is a moral sin. You know, women, you know, according to St. Paul, are supposed to be subservient to men. And then others said, well, you know, we should support this cause. So, but I was amazed when there was, I guess, when I found out there was the National Women's Anti-Suffrage Party or movement.
Yes.
And it was like, wow, women are organizing against women's suffrage, which amazed me.
Well, women today are not always on the same page, and they certainly weren't then. Yes.
Was it the Democratic Party against women's suffrage, or was it something across all parties?
It really crossed all parties, but what the suffragists did when they picketed Wilson, who was the president at the time and was head of the Democratic Party as president, they were holding Wilson and the Democratic Party as a hostage, that they needed to vote for suffrage. It was their fault if suffrage didn't pass. And so they were actually encouraging women who had the vote in, say, Western states, encouraging those women to vote against Democrats, really trying to put their feet to the fire, so to speak. And then Wilson did come around and took all the credit that that it was under his administration that the 19th Amendment did pass and was ratified. Kathy?
I know Wilson had a stroke at some point during his presidency, and there's always been speculation that his wife was making the decisions during that time. Was that before or after suffrage?
I don't know the time of that, how long his...
I wanted to look that up
Yeah.
before I came tonight.
He had his stroke in 1919, and that's one of the reasons the League of Nations failed. So it was that time, and maybe
Okay.
his wife was.
Well, it was actually passed by both the Senate and the House in 1919. It just took all that time for all the 36 states to ratify it for another year. So it could have been very close. It might have been right at that time, or...
The hunger strikes and the force feeding also helped because the publicity was so awful, and Wilson was held accountable for that.
Yes.
So he was under a lot of pressure.
I think we have to keep in mind that we're not there yet because we're not voting enough women into office. I mean, does it help us to have the vote if we continue to put men in office? And we put restrictions on the Iraqis and their government, and we said, oh, a certain percentage has to be women in your parliament, what's the word I want?
Their parliament.
It's their
Governing body.
Governing body, and we don't do that for ourselves. That's rather ironic that we have put that on
Good
other
point.
countries.
Just because we have some younger folks here tonight, I just thinking that it might be hard for them, particularly since we missed the first part of the presentation, to understand why people would not want women to have the vote. What was the primary objection to women, just because they'd never had it before?
Well, that's one thing, but as Marty mentioned, women were oftentimes considered subservient. There were times when women could not own property. If her husband divorced her, she lost everything. Women did not have lots of different rights, and voting was just one of them.
They gave a lot of physiological reasons too, because women could get pregnant, menstruated, and so on and so forth. That took all of their energy from the brain, and they therefore could not make lucid decisions during certain times of their lives.
That was the least of it.
There was also, ironically, a concern that women would never be able to send people off to war, that we would never be able to make the hard calls, and that we were too emotional, that was used as an argument pro and con, that the world would become peaceful and wonderful if women got the vote.
Think of all the
We all
nice
see
things
how that
they
worked
say.
out.
There's some women that can be just as mean as some of the men
Right.
too.
Yes. Yeah, they can be equally as bad as equally good.
So Carol, on the significant anniversary, can we expect a resurgence of interest in the ERA?
The time has passed. I mean, for ratification, it would have to start all over again.
Actually, there's been some research done that says that's not true. There's a precedent, there's a legal precedent with, and I think it had something to do with Congress voting itself a pay raise way back, but the time for ratification had passed, and yet they were still able to go ahead and continue the ratification. There's actually a group, I was telling a couple of folks last week, that's stationed in Georgia, but it's national now, called 4 ERA, and they're still working on it. They're mostly the southern states.
That's what Alice Paul did after the 19th Amendment was ratified, is that she worked for the ERA until she died in 77, never seeing it passed. So it'd be, how many states have ratified it? Quite a few.
It's quite a few.
Yeah, it'd be interesting.
We're only a few short, but you got to get the southeast geared up. So
Okay, there's a whole new movement for you, Peggy.
Thanks, Carol.
I also want to thank my friends who brought cookies. Carolyn and Karen back there. We have peanut butter blossoms with the chocolate on them, and there are two kinds over there. It's date nut bars and the ever popular oatmeal orange walnut chocolate chip cookies. Okay. So, yes.
Does anybody else think it's ironic that the 19th Amendment was changed or passed in 1919?
Yes.
Oh, very good. Sure. Unfortunately, it didn't get ratified by all the states until 1920, but it did pass Congress in 1919. I don't think anyone else picked up on that. Good for you.
It's really sad that today that, when you hear that women are being,
put in jail and force fed, and people are too lazy to get up and vote, even if you have an absentee ballot. It's really kind of sad.
It is. It is sad. Yeah.
It's really pathetic.
Does anyone have statistics for how the numbers of women voting went along those first few years or the first 20 years? Did they increase?
Someone has, but I don't really know the figures. But that's be pretty interesting to see if women really took it on, or they stayed home, or certainly there were many. I mean, I've met a woman who said her mother could hardly wait to go to the polls. She was an older woman, so there were many women who waited many years for this. What's really sad is the women who started the movement didn't live long enough to see it passed. The first call for women having the vote took place in 1848 at the Women's Right Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. And it wasn't until 1920, 72 years later, that all women got that right. So, go out there and vote. Make sure all your friends and neighbors do.
Carol, Alice Paul looked like she was younger than all the others. Was she?
She was in her 30s.
Okay.
Was she unmarried?
Yes. Yeah, she was actually was a Quaker.
Would she have survived? I mean, would she have still been alive? No, I guess not.
No, Alice Paul died in 1977, I think.
1970s?
Yeah.
1870s.
No. Alice Paul was there in 1920, in her 30s.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Okay, so she was quite an old woman when she finally
Yeah.
died.
Yeah.
She's the one that worked on the ELA.
Yes. Yeah.
Could you clarify whether all women got the right to vote or just white women?
In 1920, all women were given that right. Now, we know perfectly well that in southern states, they put up barriers, poll taxes and things like that. And so that would have kept, it kept African-American men and African-American women from voting. But according to the U.S. Constitution, they had that right. But then states came up with their own ways of keeping people they didn't want to vote from voting.
Try and do that again.
Yes.
Is that legal to have to put up barriers? Because I thought there was supposed to be a balance between state and U.S. laws.
Well, they don't do it anymore. So I think someone figured out that, and I don't know exactly how that happened. If it was brought that it was unconstitutional, or if the times just changed with the civil rights movement. A lot of things changed in the 60s.
Georgia was just recently trying to pass some things that would disenfranchise poor black people.
Well, and they've moved polling places and access to polling places. You have
it
to have a
wasn't-
specific kind of an ID card.
Oh, that's
and
it.
Folks can't get to the polling places if they can't get to the ID card and then get to the polling place. So there are a lot, it's still possible to do that.
So as long as you tell people they can't vote at all, you can get away with some things that make it difficult to vote. Okay? There's some.
I just want to mention all the young people that went down to the South in the 60s to register specifically black voters and were murdered.
Yes.
Right. All those things.
It was a very difficult time. Yeah. That was a very hard one. Right.
And I remember a young man speaking to his dad saying, watching this on TV, some brief punishments, couldn't believe this was that recent in our history. That this was happening. This was allowed. This was happening.
Yes, and we forget very quickly, unfortunately. Anything else?
Carol, thanks so much for doing that.
I couldn't let this go by. Today is the actual date, and I couldn't let it go by without doing something. And we hope to see you all here when we do the 100th. 10 years from now.
Another comment? I was just going to, just a little seed to plant is that I think this would make a fabulous badge activity for Girl Scouts or, you know.
Oh, yeah.
So for the 100th anniversary, and we have a huge scouting council here. And the young girls just have, when they hear about it, but it's not real. It just seems so far-fetched that there was a time when they would be considered not quite
Equal.
people.
Just
subservient.
Yes.
Okay.
So thanks again to Carol and to each of our facilitators. We really enjoyed it. Thanks again for coming, and male, female, young, old, if you're eligible to vote, please go to the polls in November. Thank you.
Thank you.